Apalachin 1957. A quiet upstate road, a sudden police roadblock, and dozens of perfectly dressed men who weren't supposed to exist in the same place. For the first time, the Mafia's myth almost became a photograph. What happens when the machine gets seen? For decades, the American Mafia survived by staying half imaginary, not because it wasn't real, but because it was designed to be deniable. A rumor you could feel in the way a union vote moved, a presence you could measure in the sudden agreement between rivals, a shadow you could hear in courtrooms where witnesses forgot, changed or vanished. And that system depended on one core rule: you never let the public see the whole machine in one place. You could arrest a gunman, you could flip a bookkeeper, you could raid a gambling room. The Mafia could live through that. Those were parts, replaceable, compartmentalized, burnable. But if law enforcement ever caught a clear photograph of the entire structure, bosses, underbosses, advisors, moneymen, emissaries from different cities, standing in the same frame at the same time, then the argument that there is no national organization would die overnight. That was the problem Apalachin created, because Apalachin wasn't just a meeting that got interrupted. It was a brief moment when the Mafia, by its own choice, put its leadership class under one roof. And then, because of a single roadblock and a handful of suspicious local cops, that roof turned into a trap. To understand why that mattered, you have to understand what the Mafia was trying to protect in 1957. By the mid-1950s, the Mafia had evolved from neighborhood crews into a nationwide management system for crime and influence. It wasn't only about murders and numbers rackets. It was about control without constant war, control of ports, trucking, construction, garment districts, unions, nightclubs, and the money laundering pipelines that made illegal profit look clean enough to spend. The bosses didn't want headlines. Headlines meant hearings. Hearings meant informants. Informants meant prison. So the post-war Mafia tried to run like a corporation that never filed paperwork. They also had another issue. Power had shifted, and not everyone accepted the new balance. In 1957, Vito Genovese was making his move. He had returned from exile, rebuilt alliances, and aimed at the top seat in New York. His approach was blunt: consolidate, centralize, and make the national network answer to him. To Genovese, the old-style separate bosses doing separate business was inefficient, dangerous. Too many loose egos, too many unsanctioned hits, too many freelance decisions. Others saw it differently. Men like Carlo Gambino and Tommy Lucchese understood that the Mafia's strength was its flexibility, control through quiet influence, not overt domination. Let the public argue about whether the Mafia even existed, while you collected from everyone who needed something to go smoothly. So the tension in 1957 wasn't simply who is boss, it was about what kind of Mafia would survive the next decade. And that question was supposed to be handled the way the Mafia always handled it: behind closed doors, among men who spoke in half-sentences, with rules that sounded like tradition but functioned like governance. That's why the gathering at Apalachin happened at all. Apalachin was a small town in upstate New York. Quiet roads, modest houses, not the kind of place where you'd expect limousines and tailored suits to arrive in clusters. The host was Joseph "Joe" Barbara, a local figure with the perfect cover, a rural property, respectable enough on paper, removed from big city surveillance, and connected to Buffalo boss Stefano Magaddino, one of the most entrenched and politically insulated Mafia leaders in the country. A place like that was supposed to be safe for an out-of-town summit. Not safe in the Hollywood sense, no guards with machine guns at the gate, but safe in the Mafia sense, too boring for federal agents, too remote for city police details, too routine for anyone to question why certain cars were parked too close together. The plan, as later pieced together, wasn't a party, it was business, and not small business. People have argued for decades about the exact agenda, whether it was about recognizing Genovese's authority, settling disputes, approving profit-sharing arrangements, or discussing major rackets. But the point is this: it drew a crowd that should never have existed in one place if secrecy was the priority, because secrecy wasn't just a preference, it was the Mafia's legal armor. In 1957, federal law still struggled to prosecute a national criminal organization without the modern tools that would come later. RICO, long-term conspiracy frameworks that could swallow an entire hierarchy, and the kind of electronic surveillance that would eventually rewrite the game. At that moment in American law enforcement, the Mafia's best defense was plausible fragmentation. A prosecutor could say, "This man ran gambling." The defense could say, "He's a businessman." A prosecutor could say, "This man ordered a hit." The defense could say, "No evidence." But if you could show a national summit, leaders from New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Florida, and beyond, then you could argue organization, coordination, governance, a board of directors, and the Mafia knew that, which is what makes the Apalachin mistake so revealing. This wasn't arrogance without intelligence. Many of these men were careful, seasoned, and paranoid by nature. They used intermediaries, coded language, and quiet diplomacy because they understood exposure was fatal. So why did they still gather? Because the system had reached a point where private, one-on-one negotiations weren't enough. Too many moving parts were colliding. Control of unions, control of routes, control of Las Vegas money, control of who had the right to earn in which city, and above all, control of succession, who could claim legitimacy and who would be treated as a problem that needed to be removed. The Mafia wanted what governments want when the internal balance becomes unstable, a meeting that resets the rules without admitting the rules exist. That was Apalachin's purpose, a pressure release, a coordination point, a vote without a ballot. And then a simple, almost small-town kind of suspicion broke through the entire illusion. A local state trooper, Edgar D. Croswell, noticed unusual activity. Too many expensive cars, too many unfamiliar faces, too much traffic heading toward Barbara's property. Depending on whose account you trust, there were also practical details that didn't fit. Deliveries, catering, out-of-area plates, and men who didn't look like they belonged to a rural neighborhood. Croswell and a few officers didn't need a federal task force. They didn't need a wiretap. They needed something far more basic, the ability to stand on a road and ask, "Where are you going?" A roadblock is not a grand tactic. It's the oldest form of control a state has, a uniform and a question, and that's why it's such a perfect symbol for what happened next. Because the Mafia's invisible order depended on movement without friction, on being able to travel, meet, and decide things as if the world was theirs. It depended on everyone else looking away, either because they were paid to, scared to, or simply trained to assume nothing to see. A roadblock forces visibility. It turns private motion into public explanation, and in Apalachin, visibility was panic. The story people remember is the scramble men running into the woods, slipping through backyards, trying to ditch evidence, trying to look like harmless visitors who got lost. Some were caught with mud on their shoes and expensive suits torn. Some tried to claim they were there for a barbecue, a friendly visit, a sick friend. But the deeper story, the one that matters for how power actually works, is what came after the running stopped. Because the real damage wasn't that dozens of men were detained and questioned. The damage was that the Mafia suddenly had a public problem it couldn't bribe away quietly, a spectacle, a headline, a photograph in the mind of the country, and inside their own world it created a more dangerous problem, accountability. When an operation fails at that level, somebody pays, not morally, strategically. Someone gets blamed, someone gets isolated, someone becomes safe to sacrifice so the structure can survive. Apalachin forced a question the Mafia hated because it had no clean answer. Was this a freak accident, or proof that someone had been careless, compromised, or disloyal? And the next day, in rooms far from Apalachin, the conversation wasn't only who got picked up, it was who is now too hot to protect, who brings law enforcement pressure to our door. Who do we cut loose so the rest of us can keep earning? That is the problem this story is really about. Not the roadblock itself, but the panic vote that followed, the moment when the Mafia had to decide under stress what it truly valued: loyalty or survival, tradition or control, ego or structure. Because when the machine becomes visible, it doesn't just attract enemies, it also forces the machine to show its own teeth at its own people. The first thing that happened after Apalachin wasn't a hit or a dramatic purge, it was silence. Not the calm kind, more like a sudden vacuum, as if an entire network stopped breathing at once. Phones went quiet, meetings got postponed, couriers were told to wait. Men who normally loved to be seen in the right restaurants suddenly stayed home, because Apalachin didn't just create arrests, it created attention, and attention is the one thing a long-running conspiracy can't tolerate. Law enforcement had names now, not just some gamblers, not just a local racketeer. They had a list of men, pulled from traffic stops and hurried interrogations, connected by one location on one day, and the country had a picture in its head it couldn't unsee. Dozens of well-dressed men from all over scattering into the woods like they'd been caught doing something they couldn't explain. To the public, it looked like a secret society got spooked. To prosecutors, it looked like organization. To the Mafia itself, it looked like the most dangerous word of all, exposure. And exposure changes the internal math. It turns friendships into liabilities. It turns alliances into bargaining chips. It turns a man's name into a contagious disease. Within hours, leaders in New York and Buffalo and New Jersey were trying to answer the same questions fast. Who saw what? Who got photographed? Who gave their real name? Who talked too much? Who did the police recognize instantly? And most importantly, who would the newspapers keep printing tomorrow? The Apalachin list mattered because it created a new category of problem, known leadership. If the government could point to the same core group again and again, it could argue continuity, an ongoing conspiracy, not random criminals. The Mafia had always relied on the fact that proving a commission was like proving smoke had a boss. Everyone felt it, nobody could hold it. Apalachin gave the smoke a meeting address, and the irony was brutal. A rural property was chosen because it felt invisible. But in a small town, unusual looks louder than it does in a city. In Manhattan, a line of black cars is nothing. In Apalachin, it's a parade. When Trooper Edgar Croswell and his men set up that roadblock, they weren't thinking in terms of national syndicate. They were thinking like locals. Something isn't right, and we're going to find out what it is. That's why the stops were so effective. They didn't need probable cause for a wiretap. They didn't need a years-long investigation. They just needed to slow traffic and look people in the face, and those faces were the problem. Some were recognized immediately by officers who'd seen mugshots. Others weren't famous to the local cops, but they looked like what they were. Men who lived by control, suddenly trapped in a situation they couldn't control. Then the flight started. Cars reversed direction. Men abandoned vehicles. Suits and overcoats disappeared into brush and trees. Some tried to cut across fields. Some tried to blend in like they were taking a walk. Some stayed, gave their names and hoped routine would protect them. But routine didn't protect anyone that day. Because the story was too clean. You don't get that many influential out-of-town men in one place by accident. In the following days, officials would argue about numbers. How many attended? How many were detained? How many were charged? But from the Mafia's point of view, the exact count didn't matter. What mattered was that the mask slipped. For years, a key public argument had been that the Mafia was exaggerated, a media myth, a political talking point, a convenient excuse for unsolved murders. Even when investigators believed in a national structure, proving it in court was another game entirely. Apalachin didn't prove every detail, but it proved enough to shift the climate. Suddenly, judges and juries could imagine a boardroom. Suddenly, politicians could justify budgets. Suddenly, federal agencies that had been reluctant, divided, or cautious had a single event they could point to and say, "This is real, and it's coordinated." Inside the Underworld, that shift triggered a different kind of emergency meeting, one that wasn't held in a fancy property with catered food. It was held through trusted calls, private sit-downs, intermediaries, and whispered conversations in back rooms where nobody stayed long. Because now the Mafia had two battles at once. The external battle, how to survive the law enforcement surge, and the internal battle, how to assign blame without starting a war. Apalachin by itself didn't destroy the Mafia. What it destroyed was the comfort of denial. And denial was a shield that protected everyone, even rivals, even arrogant men, even reckless earners. When that shield cracks, leaders start making decisions that look cold, even by their standards. Not because they suddenly become cruel, but because they become defensive. And defensive power is always more dangerous than confident power. This is where the panic vote begins, not as a formal ballot with hands raised, but as a series of decisions that functioned like a vote. Who gets protected, who gets pushed away, and whose name becomes the explanation that saves everyone else. Because an organization like this can't admit we made a systemic mistake, it needs a scapegoat. It needs a narrative that contains the damage, and there were several candidates. The host, Joe Barbara, was an obvious one. His property became the scene. His judgment could be questioned. Why invite that many people? Why not stagger arrivals? Why not hold smaller sessions? Why not use a location less predictable, less connected, less owned? But blaming Barbara alone was convenient in a way that made it suspicious. It was too easy. It let everyone else pretend they were careful and unlucky, instead of careless and exposed. Then there was Buffalo's leadership, especially Stefano Magaddino, an elder figure with deep roots, the kind of boss who didn't like outsiders telling him how to run his territory. If Apalachin happened under his umbrella, did that make him responsible, or did it simply make him embarrassed? And hovering above the entire question was the man many believed was rising fastest, Vito Genovese. Because the meeting wasn't just a social gathering, it was tied, directly or indirectly, to a national power reset, a moment of alignment, a moment of recognition, a moment where certain men would leave the room stronger than they entered. If Genovese had been pushing for a big table solution, bring everyone together, settle everything at once, then Apalachin was the nightmare outcome of his approach. And here's the part that makes this story more than a police tale. The Mafia didn't fear arrests the way normal people imagine. Many of these men had been arrested before. Some had done time. Some had beaten cases so often it started to feel like a skill. What they feared was the long-term heat that ruins business. After Apalachin, the heat wasn't going to fall evenly. It would fall where it always falls, on the most visible, the most ambitious, and the most politically inconvenient. That meant certain bosses and captains suddenly became bad for everyone. If you were a leader trying to keep your own family stable, you had to ask a brutal question: is protecting this man worth the pressure his name brings to my door? That's the logic of the panic vote. Not morality, risk management. And it didn't require one single summit to happen. It could happen in fragments. A consigliere tells a boss, we can't be seen with him right now. A union fixer is told, take instructions from someone else. A key earner is quietly cut out of a pipeline. A long-standing partner is suddenly treated like a stranger. And at the top level, the most powerful form of voting happens without speeches. Who gets invited to the next table and who doesn't? Apalachin changed invitation lists overnight. Men who had been comfortable showing their faces at weddings, banquets, and public events suddenly had to shrink their presence. Men who liked to travel had to stop traveling. Men who were building national influence had to slow down because moving too fast now meant dragging a spotlight behind them. So when people say Apalachin exposed the Mafia, that's true in the obvious sense. But the deeper truth is this: Apalachin exposed the Mafia to itself. It forced the leadership class to confront something they preferred to ignore, that their system only worked as long as everyone maintained discipline, not just silence. Discipline. And the morning after, the discipline problem looked like a human problem. Somebody had brought too many people. Somebody had trusted the wrong kind of quiet town. Somebody had misread the moment. Somebody had acted like they were untouchable. And in a world where mistakes threaten everyone, the next decision is never, how do we forgive? It's who do we isolate so we can keep functioning? Because the Mafia could survive a raid. It could survive a trial. It could survive even a sensational headline. What it couldn't survive was leaders acting like Apalachin was normal. So the most important consequence wasn't the roadblock itself. It was the rapid, nervous consensus that formed afterward. The organization needed to look smaller than it was, quieter than it was, and more fragmented than it really was, even if that meant sacrificing the men who wanted to look big. And that is exactly where the panic vote pointed. Toward ambition, toward visibility, toward anyone whose rise now looked like a threat, not only to rivals, but to the survival strategy of the entire machine. That's the paradox of Apalachin. The Mafia didn't collapse when it was seen, it adapted. But adaptation always has a cost, and somebody always pays it first. In the weeks after the meeting, the public story kept growing. Newspapers treated it like a cracked safe. Every day, another name, another face, another connection that had previously lived in rumor. Police departments that used to shrug at the word mafia suddenly had a single event they could cite without sounding paranoid. And in Washington, the mood shifted from suspicion to momentum. Committees wanted answers, agencies wanted funding. Politicians wanted to be the ones on camera saying they would clean it up. For the mafia, that mattered more than any one arrest, because a prosecutor with ambition is more dangerous than a cop with a badge. A prosecutor builds careers on patterns, and Apalachin looked like a pattern the size of the country, so the internal response was fast, and it was pragmatic. First came the containment story. The most important thing was to prevent Apalachin from becoming a template, an example law enforcement could repeat. If a roadblock could spook a summit once, it could happen again. That meant fewer summits, fewer large gatherings, less travel, more separation. But separation creates another problem. You can't manage a national network without communication. So the Mafia adjusted the way any clandestine organization adjusts after a breach. Layers, buffers, cutouts, messengers who didn't know the full message, meetings that looked like accidents instead of events. And along with those structural adjustments came the emotional adjustments, the social consequences that feel personal but are actually policy. Certain men became too loud, not loud in the way they spoke, loud in the way their name now sounded to law enforcement, loud in the way their face looked to a witness, loud in the way their presence invited surveillance. After Apalachin, the worst sin wasn't being violent. It wasn't even being greedy. It was being visible at the wrong moment. This is where the panic vote becomes real, because you can see its results in the way power shifts afterward. A man like Vito Genovese wanted central authority. He wanted the kind of top-down control that requires big decisions, and eventually, big meetings. Apalachin made big look reckless. It turned the idea of a strong, visible national leadership into a liability, and it gave his rivals, especially the men who preferred quiet control, a powerful argument. Your style doesn't protect us, it exposes us. So when the organization began to vote with its choices, it leaned away from the men who pulled attention toward themselves and toward the men who could keep business moving without lighting up a map. That's why Apalachin isn't just a law enforcement victory story. It's a story about how coalitions form under fear. Because fear doesn't create loyalty, fear creates calculation. If you were a boss in New York or New Jersey watching those headlines, you weren't thinking about ethics, you were thinking about the next 6 months. Which unions will get investigated, which politicians will stop taking calls, which judges will suddenly feel pressure, which crews will start freelancing because the top is distracted, which ambitious man might drag you into a fight you don't want. So the vote wasn't held in one room with a gavel, it happened through alignment. Who returned calls, who got delayed, who got iced out, who was allowed to speak for the organization, and who was quietly treated as a problem. And once that alignment forms, the next stage is inevitable, sacrifice. Because there's a logic in clandestine power that outsiders often misunderstand. When an organization is threatened, it doesn't become more sentimental, it becomes more organizational. It starts treating people the way a ship treats cargo during a storm. If something is too heavy and the ship is taking on water, you don't debate whether the cargo deserves to be thrown overboard. You debate whether throwing it overboard will keep the ship afloat. Apalachin made certain careers feel like heavy cargo. Joseph Barbara, the host, never recovered in terms of trust. His property was now a symbol. Even if he hadn't betrayed anyone, his name was permanently linked to the most embarrassing exposure the Mafia had suffered in the modern era. That kind of association doesn't fade, it contaminates. And the elders in Buffalo, men like Magadino, faced something even worse than embarrassment, diminished authority, because authority in that world depends on the belief that you can protect your own territory. If your territory becomes the place where the national leadership gets caught running into the woods, the myth of your control takes a hit. But the biggest shift was at the top, where the long-term consequences moved quietly toward one conclusion. Genovese's moment was going to be short. Not because Apalachin directly put him in prison, not because a single roadblock ended his reign, but because Apalachin gave his rivals the leverage they needed. It made taking him down feel like self-defense, not ambition. And the Mafia is very good at turning ambition into self-defense when it needs consensus. Within a couple years, Genovese was convicted on narcotics charges and sent away. Whether you view that as pure law enforcement success or as a rival-driven setup with government help, the strategic point remains the same. After Apalachin, the organization moved away from a man whose style threatened the group's survival strategy. That is the panic vote's final tally. Not written down, not announced, but enforced. And outside the underworld, Apalachin reshaped the national conversation. The FBI, long criticized for downplaying or deprioritizing mafia structure, faced pressure to treat organized crime as an organized system. Investigators began connecting cities instead of treating cases as isolated. Local departments began sharing information instead of competing for credit. It didn't end corruption. It didn't end rackets. But it changed the game board. It made the idea of a national mafia harder to dismiss, and it pushed law enforcement toward the kind of long-horizon thinking that would eventually lead to more sophisticated prosecutions. So what did one roadblock actually do? It did something bigger than catching men in suits. It forced an invisible order to perform in public for just long enough that everyone could recognize it. And the moment the public recognized it, the Mafia had to react in the only way it knows how, by tightening, by simplifying, by reducing risk, by choosing who would be protected and who would be left exposed. That's the real lesson of Apalachin. Power doesn't fall when it's seen. Power changes shape, and when it changes shape, it leaves behind the people who don't fit the new shape anymore, no matter how important they were yesterday. Because the Mafia's real religion was never loyalty in the romantic sense. It was continuity. Keep the money moving. Keep the structure alive. Keep the heat away from the center. And if the center is threatened, you don't argue about feelings. You count votes with consequences. Apalachin is remembered as a failure, and it was. But it was also a rare moment of clarity. A moment when the hidden machinery became visible, and you could see the real engine underneath. Not violence, not swagger, not even fear. Decision-making under pressure. Who gets sacrificed? Who gets shielded? And how quickly family becomes risk, the moment the outside world starts looking directly at the table. In the next story, we're going to stay in that same world of quiet decisions, because the most dangerous moves are rarely the ones made with guns. They're the ones made with agreement, with silence, and with the kind of vote nobody admits happened until years later, when the damage is already done.